Hello, I'm Nuala McGovern. This is Outside Source. Russian attacks on cities are continuing despite the offer from Russia to create safe routes out. People queue for hours to escape, but the proposed humanitarian corridors will take people to Russia and to its ally, Belarus.
In the last several days, more strikes have killed and wounded civilians as they try to leave the cities that are being surrounded.
Residents in the town of Irpin, just north of Kyiv, are trying to survive or flee the intense bombardment.
Well, this is a difficult journey every step of the way, especially for older people trying to pick their way out across rubble and concrete, having to balance on bits of wood.
Oil prices hit their highest in almost 14 years after the US flags a potential ban on Russian supplies with other countries. The European leaders are reluctant to turn off the taps just yet. And what does this symbol mean, and why is it appearing on Russian tanks and at pro-Russian protests? We're going to find out. Welcome to the programme. A ceasefire was due to come into force today in parts of Ukraine to allow civilians to leave areas besieged by Russian military forces. But the two sides cannot agree on what a safe route is. Moscow said it would open humanitarian corridors to allow the evacuations of civilians from several Ukrainian cities, but only to Russia or Belarus. Now, that prospect has been branded immoral by Ukraine, and this is from one of the country's deputy prime ministers.
We demand that the Russian Federation stop manipulating and abusing the trust of world leaders and open the routes we have indicated. We demand that they accept our routes and establish a ceasefire. I appeal to President Macron, Prime Minister Johnson, and President Biden to help open real, effective humanitarian corridors that will save the lives of hundreds of thousands of people.
Well, let's take a closer look at exactly what is being proposed here. So the corridor from Kyiv would lead to Belarus, as I mentioned, an ally of Russia. Civilians from Kharkiv, they would only have a corridor leading to Russia. Then corridors from the cities of Mariupol and Sumy, they would lead to other Ukrainian cities or to Russia. Now, it's been met with condemnation by French President Emmanuel Macron. He says all this is not serious. It is a moral and political cynicism, which I find intolerable. And this is what the Russian Defense Ministry said earlier.
Today, the 7th of March, starting at 10 a.m. Moscow time, Russia has declared a ceasefire to open 6 humanitarian corridors. The first is from Kyiv to Homel. There are 2 more from Mariupol to Zaporizhzhia and Rostov-on-Don. 1 is from Kharkiv to Belgorod, and there are 2 from Sumy to Belgorod and Poltava. Detailed information about the humanitarian corridors was given to the Ukrainian side in advance, as well as dedicated entities of the United Nations, the OSCE, and the International Committees of the Red Cross.
So a very different take to President Macron. Well, let's take a closer look at the areas under Russian control now. You can see them there labelled in red. The port of Mariupol in the south. Tens of thousands of civilians are trapped. It's especially important as it ensures Ukraine's access to the Black Sea. But the main concentration, as you can see there in the north, of Russian forces is still around Kyiv. And there are fresh warnings from Ukraine, from the authorities there, that there will be an all-out assault on the capital. Let me bring you a little analysis from our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucette, in the city.
There is the fear that this is a conflict which will never end, because so many believed in the run-up to this invasion that it simply wouldn't happen, and it did. Many people believe that Russia would not try to attack historic cities full of meaning, sacred meaning for both Russians and Ukrainians, would not come under attack. But tonight we're hearing that the beautiful city of Odessa on the Black Sea coast, described as a place of operas and beaches and Pushkin and a long and storied history, is now coming under attack. People are asking, would President Putin order his forces to establish a city like Kyiv, so full of risk, because the Ukrainians will put up a defense, both soldiers and civilians, so full of history, precious history, to both Russians and Ukrainians. With every day which goes by, this war becomes more and more terrifying.
Let me bring you further assessment on Russia's military strategy.
what we see is 12 days of initial war, where Russia doesn't seem to have accomplished their initial gains, or at least the assumptions that they had, that they could push through very easily into Ukrainian territory, capture or seize lands very quickly, and then create a form of fait accompli after the first few days. This has not happened.
Well, we want to turn now to the recent days which have seen intense shelling in areas to the northwest of the capital, Kyiv. This is from one of the affected cities called Irpin. 2,000 civilians have reportedly been evacuated from there. Some residents were forced to cross the river using planks after a bridge was destroyed. And we also know that at least 4 people from the same family were killed as they tried to reach safety. This was from the Ukrainians' president reaction to that.
We will not forgive the shooting of unarmed people, destruction of our infrastructure. We will not forgive. Hundreds and hundreds of victims, thousands and thousands suffering, and God will not forgive. Not today, not tomorrow, never. And instead of forgiveness, there will be a day of judgment.
Well, Russia has also been targeting the city of Kharkiv with airstrikes that President Zelensky has called war crimes. Let me bring you these pictures showing the aftermath of a missile bombing there today. I also want to bring you Natalia Zubar. She's in Kharkiv with more on the impact of that constant shelling, which is preventing civilians from leaving.
It's horrible. I experienced it myself. The bomb hit about less than a big air bomb was hit a historical building, very beautiful, near the city council, 1 kilometer away from me. And I can tell you it's a terror. Everything is shattered all around. The historic area, all the glass is almost all the windows are broken, the doors are broken, and the people who are experiencing such an intense shelling for so many days, they are all victims of a war crime.
Well, we know there have been many civilian casualties. I want to bring you the UN's latest estimate. Since the Russian invasion began, 406 civilians have been killed, they say, also including 27 children. An additional 801 people have been injured. And the US Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, had this to say.
In the last several days, more strikes have killed and wounded civilians as they try to leave the cities that are being surrounded by Russian forces. Women and children, the elderly, wounded civilians, people with disabilities are trying to escape cities where there's no heat, no electricity, relentless bombardment, and where they're running out of food and medicine. And there have continued to be reports of attacks by Russian forces on agreed-upon humanitarian corridors.
And that this is the fastest growing refugee crisis since World War II. The estimate is that more than 1.5 million people have now left Ukraine since the Russian invasion began. I want to bring you a map which shows the countries that have received refugees from Ukraine. So more than 1 million are now in Poland. Hungary and Slovakia, they've each received over 100,000 people. Moldova, Romania and also Russia have seen more than 50,000 people cross their respective borders. The western Ukrainian city of Lviv has reached the limit of its capacity to help those who have been displaced. Here's one volunteer speaking to the BBC from Lviv.
In the first days, we were also shocked and devastated. We just really had no clue what we were going to do at all. But some of my colleagues here at the Center for Urban History, which is a historical research institution, we thought we have a conference room, we have a cafe, and those can be turned into a temporary shelter. And well, in the next few days, we had such a flood of refugees that probably Lviv has not seen in whole of its history.
I want to go outside of the borders now to our correspondent Nick Thorpe in Budapest. So he's been watching refugees arriving at one of the main train stations there.
The sheer number of children, just behind me, the other side on the station, platform 10, where all those trains are coming in every hour or so. As the train comes in, one sees all the faces in the window, one sees young women carrying babies, helping them down onto the platform, and the children looking completely bemused, brought out here, handed a bowl of soup, and there's sometimes, as their parents, or rather as their mothers or older sisters or older brothers try to sort out accommodation or travel on, then the sort of children are left alone for a while. Then hopefully one of the volunteers, the many volunteers here, hopefully many of them speaking the language, are coming over, checking that these small children can open their bowls of hot soup and so on. So, but as you say, yes, the women and children, this is a sea of women and children really at this station and all these places up and down this 2,100-kilometre long border of Ukraine to the west.
So part of the picture in Hungary there. Well, the UK Ministry of Defence says that a 40-mile long convoy of Russian military vehicles remains close to the capital, Kyiv, but that little progress has been made in recent days. But as we've been reporting, fighting does continue in places like Irpin, about 16 miles from the city boundary. Orla Guerin has this report from the town, which is under heavy bombardment, is also crucial to the Russian advance.
The only way out. And he stumbles, hands shaking, but he summons his courage and carries on. The desperate exodus from Irpin today, across the wreckage of a bridge blown up by Ukraine to slow the Russian advance. How scared do you have to be to take your child and flee like this? And here a woman lies conscious, but immobile. She fell and there's no stretcher to move her. Well, this is a difficult journey every step of the way, especially for older people trying to pick their way out across rubble and concrete, having to balance on bits of wood. Ukrainian troops are trying to help them make their way forward. Some are coming with their children. Most are coming with a few small things they can carry. They've been under bombardment in Irpin for days, and they're not safe now, even as they try to leave. The shelling has been continuing. For many civilians in the town, the shelling hit home. Like Anastasia, whose baby son Oleg is just 5 months old. The day before yesterday, a shell hit our house, she tells me. We spent 2 days at my grandmother's. Now we are leaving because it's too dangerous to be in any corner of Irpin with a child. Suddenly, this. Some Ukrainian forces running for cover. Others getting civilians out of the line of fire. Kyiv is just half an hour away. If Ukraine loses this town, and it's already lost some of it, the Russians will be on the road to the capital. Andrei, like many here, is begging for a no-fly zone.
Tell everybody to close the sky, urgently. All people need it in Ukraine, really. Many people stay in Irpin for now. They can't go outside. Some old people, some young people, they try to do their best there. But we see the Russian soldiers, they don't fight it with army, they fight it with anyone. So tell please to close the sky.
For now, all many can do is cram into minibuses bound for the train station in Kyiv. Generations of Ukrainians at the mercy of an increasingly brutal Russian advance. Orla Guerin, BBC News, Irpin.
Thanks very much to Orla. Well, I want to turn to the UN Security Council in New York. It is holding an emergency meeting on the humanitarian crisis triggered in Ukraine by the Russian invasion. I want to listen in. This is the Undersecretary of Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordination.
Setting up supply chain operations to deliver immediate food and cash assistance to 3 to 5 million people inside Ukraine. WHO has shipped trauma care, emergency surgery equipment and other supplies that will help in days to come thousands of people, and more supplies are on their way. HCR is providing assistance, albeit as a small scale at the moment, through a network of shops and supermarkets in Mariupol in collaboration with NGOs. MSF never left. It's training trauma surgeons, providing support for the people in that city. It's bringing in thousands, UNHCR is bringing in thousands of blankets, mattresses and other non-food items from Poland, thank you to Poland, and shipping them to transit centres. And we're going to hear, and I look forward to hearing a lot more about the experience of children from Kathy, from the vital work of UNICEF and its partners. The Ukrainian Red Cross has distributed humanitarian assistance to thousands via its emergency stockpiles, including hygiene and food kits, warm clothing and medicine. And I would like to take the chance here to salute the more than 4,000 Ukraine Red Cross volunteers across the country, used to conflict, of course, the community workers also of local NGOs, the truck drivers carrying basic necessities into volatile areas. These are people all in harm's way who have no hesitation in carrying out their mission. Madam President, I see three immediate priorities to lessen the pain and suffering we're all watching unfold in real time. First, the parties need to take constant care to spare civilians and civilian homes and infrastructure in their military operations. This includes allowing safe passage for civilians to leave areas of active hostilities on a voluntary basis in the direction they choose. All civilians, whether they stay or leave, must be respected and protected. Second, we need safe passage for humanitarian supplies into areas of active hostilities. Civilians in places like Mariupol, Kharkiv, Melitopol and elsewhere desperately need aid, especially life-saving medical supplies, the kind that have been brought in these past days by WHO. Many modalities are possible, but it must take place in line with the parties' obligation under the laws of war. And thirdly, we urgently need a system of constant communication with the parties to the conflict and assurances to enable the delivery of humanitarian aid. And we have seen these systems in place in other countries, of course, as you know well. A humanitarian notification system, as we term it, can support delivery of aid at the scale needed. I have already conveyed these 3 points to the authorities of Ukraine and to the Russian Federation. And on the third point, thanks to the cooperation with the Russian Federation, my office has sent a team to Moscow to work on better humanitarian civil-military coordination that can allow us to scale up, precisely to begin to establish a humanitarian notification system. This follows last Friday's phone call between the Secretary General and the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, Sergei Shoigu. UN teams have held the first technical meeting with the representatives of the Ministry of Defense.
So we're listening there to Martin Griffiths. As you can see there, he's the Undersecretary for Humanitarian Affairs and also Energy Release Coordinator. He actually was a special envoy previously to Yemen, so everybody expects that the war between Ukraine and Russia will have far-reaching implications, including even food supplies to Yemen, for example. Interesting to listen to him there. I think the main line to take away is that he says the parties must allow safe passage for civilians to leave areas of active hostilities on a voluntary basis in the direction they choose. That, of course, was the point of contention today. Some of the passage was back to Russia or indeed to Belarus. Well, when it comes to diplomacy, there is a third round of talks that took place between Ukrainian and Russian delegations. They were held in Belarus. Here you can see both sides meeting at that table. But a Ukrainian negotiator said the talks did not lead to any result that significantly improved the situation. Elsewhere, the Turkish foreign minister said Russia and Ukraine's foreign ministers, so Sergei Lavrov and Dmytro Kuleba, will meet in the Turkish city of Antalya. That will be on Thursday. Let's hear to a little more of what he had to say.
Both ministers asked me to particularly take part in this meeting as a three-way meeting. Therefore, on Thursday, we'll hold this meeting in Antalya. We hope it'll be a milestone and an important step towards peace and stability.
So those talks, as I mentioned, between Russia and Ukraine haven't come to anything yet. Russia is insisting it will only stop the invasion if Ukraine meets all of its demands. Now today, Russia set out its most detailed statement yet on what it wants to end the fighting. The demands that were outlined by the Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov, and they include the following: a ceasing of military action against the Russian invasion, a change to Ukraine's constitution to enshrine what Russia calls neutrality, acknowledging Crimea as Russian territory and also recognising the separatist republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. But meanwhile, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, well, he's on a visit to the Baltic region, so he's holding talks with Lithuania, Latvia and also Estonia. And the Baltic nations are the only former Soviet republics to have joined both NATO and the European Union. Mr. Blinken said NATO is continuously looking at extending troop deployments in the region and increasing the number of permanent deployments. Here's Mr. Blinken speaking earlier.
It's not okay for one country to try to dictate to another its choices, its future, its policies, with whom it can associate. Principles like it's not okay for one country to say it has a sphere of influence over another, to try to subjugate that country to its will. All of that is at stake here by Russia's aggression.
Well, China has offered to mediate between the European Union and Russia. Speaking in Beijing, China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi said that if needed, China would be part of a mediation process together with others in the international community. The EU's Foreign Policy Chief, Josep Borrell, said he had spoken with Chinese ministers today and asked them to influence Russia to try and persuade them to accept a diplomatic resolve to the conflict. But the US has a different view on Chinese diplomacy. Well, here's one voice in the United States, the former National Security Advisor, also former ambassador to the UN, John Bolton.
Bringing China in to mediate this or to try and resolve it is like figuring out how to enhance China's power in Europe. I don't see the logic to that at all.
Here in London, Britain's Prime Minister Boris Johnson, he's been meeting with his Canadian counterpart Justin Trudeau, also the Dutch Premier Mark Rutte. At a Downing Street press conference, Mr Johnson said the three countries stand shoulder to shoulder against Russia's barbaric invasion of Ukraine. Let's hear a little more of what they had to say.
In the 12 days since Russia launched this illegal and brutal assault, the world has come together in solidarity with the indomitable people of Ukraine.
The focus is on the people of Ukraine and our solidarity with Ukraine, our pushing back against the illegal Russian invasion of Ukraine and standing up for democracies around the world.
And we are all prepared to consider all possible sanctions that can help put pressure on Russia. And obviously there's a lot of debate going on about energy sanctions. And here we should not make a mistake. We have to ensure that they don't generate unmanageable risks to energy supplies in European countries and beyond, including Ukraine.
I just want to bring you some news that came to us in the past hour or so. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is to make what's been called a historic address to British MPs in the House of Commons on Tuesday. So that's been announced by the House Speaker. Meanwhile, the latest British military assessment of the fighting says Russian forces are deliberately targeting Ukraine's communication systems to prevent people from getting access to reliable information. American military sources, they've said the Russians are still meeting strong resistance and they haven't secured full control of Ukrainian airspace. Our diplomatic correspondent, Caroline Hawley, has this update on the advance of Russian forces.
So let's have a look now at the latest map of how things are on the ground. The red areas in the east, south and north of Ukraine are controlled by Russia, and the striped areas are where Russian forces are still advancing, still meeting strong resistance. Here you can see some of the key cities, the capital Kyiv, where, as you've heard, there's been intense fighting north of the city. And then here in the south, Russia now controls significant areas as it's pushed east and north out of Crimea, which it occupied in 2014. President Zelensky has now warned that Russian forces are close to the historic Black Sea port of Odessa and that they're preparing to bomb it. For the Ukrainian government and aid agencies, the urgent priority is now to get civilians to safety as the humanitarian situation worsens by the hour. The port of Mariupol has been under siege for several days now under what's been described as relentless bombardment. Hundreds of thousands of people are trapped in the city with no water, no electricity, very little food. It's too dangerous for people even to bury their dead or get the wounded out for treatment. Over the weekend, 2 ceasefires failed. This is one of the proposed evacuation routes for civilians to leave Mariupol, but most of the humanitarian corridors that the Kremlin is offering lead to either Russia or its ally Belarus, i.e. into enemy hands. And the Ukrainian government has described that as immoral.
Thanks to Caroline. Well, I want to turn back to the UN Security Council in New York. They're holding an emergency meeting at on the humanitarian crisis that has been triggered by all the issues we've talked about between Ukraine and Russia. You can see Catherine Russell there. She is the Executive Director of the Children's Fund. I just want to bring you some of the lines. The UN aid chief, we were hearing from him earlier, Martin Griffiths. He said we need safe passage in Ukraine for humanitarian supplies into areas of active hostilities. He also continued to say that the people who want to leave need to be given a safe passage to cross and go in the direction that they want. Of course, a point of contention earlier today as we were discussing. And he says we need a system of constant communication with parties to the conflict and assurances to enable the delivery of humanitarian aid. So just some of the lines coming right now from the UN in New York.